Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Talk Show. Really excited about the show today. It's the show on vampires.
Yeah, we're talking what the Catholic Church has believed about vampires throughout the years, the historical fact that the real Dracula was actually a Catholic, the crazy folklore that Adam's first wife was the mother of all vampires, and a lot of other really cool folklore to explore.
So grab your vampire slaying kits. Your exercise salt is an important item. And let's begin this show in 3, 2, 1. Blah, blah, blah.
All right, so glad to have everybody back for another episode. We're here in the studio with Ryan and Father Rich, as always.
How's it going, guys?
Doing great.
I'm excited about this episode. Like, vampires in the Catholic Church, I never made that assumption. So.
Well, I remember Castlevania back in the day, and like all of the toolkit that the main character had with the holy water and the crosses and stuff. So I'm excited to get into the real deep Catholic stuff.
Yeah, when you think about vampire slaying, it's not they're not throwing a Methodist hymnal at them. It's Catholics. It's holy water and it's crucifixes and holy salt. I mean, vampires fear the Catholic Church, and that's what we want to talk about today. We expose those blood-sucking demons.
Absolutely.
Before we start talking about vampires, Father Rich, you got something to say.
Well, I do. Well, if you want a vampire slaying kit, you should be a Patreon. So maybe we could work out a vampire slaying kit.
I'll see if I can OEM one.
Absolutely. So if you want to be a Patreon for our show and continue to support our good efforts and to really get the show out there, visit us at patreon.com/Catholic Talk Show. Help us, in any way that you possibly can, and especially for all of our viewers. Definitely pray for what we're doing. Connect with us on social media, from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook, and we love journeying with you in faith and continuing to delve into these awesome topics.
Yeah. All right, so let's drive a stake in this one.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So vampires are probably it's one of the biggest cultural phenomenons of phenomenons. It's one of those
works,
too.
Yeah. Phenomenon.
But, in the horror genre, in movies and in all different sorts of media, I mean, you see vampires. Vampires are a very prevalent thing in our society and in our popular consciousness.
Recent.
But it's not.
It's not. Okay.
Yeah,
So, I mean, if you look at
centuries.
vampires, it goes back to Mesopotamia. People believed in vampires.
Mm-hmm.
So vampires have been around for millennia.
So-
And the whole idea really is that there's a revenant, something that comes back from the dead. And I think it really comes from that idea of people fearing death and not understanding how death works, and that something that personifies death itself is where the whole mythology around vampires comes from.
And hence the whole casket idea, and that they out of the casket. That's what they do. That's the sound
And they
that it
stick
makes.
their arms up like that.
their
too,
arms come up first.
It's stretching them out a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I've been in here for 4 weeks.
They have no bioflex. Or,
Have vampires always been the same in a sense, historically, contextually? Like, have they always been coming out of a casket? Have they always,
So not really, and we're going to get into that. So,
okay, cool.
Originally, so the word vampire, there's some dispute on where the word actually comes from. But most people who study linguistics will say that vampire comes from a Serbian word, which would be vreprica, which would mean something that bites or thrusts, right? And conversely, they said that word actually comes from a Turkish word. So this is going back where you're starting to get into Middle Eastern beliefs and Mesopotamian beliefs. But there's a Turkish word that was called ubir or upir, which was basically how they would have said witch. So from upir to vepir, it started to take on the connotation of an undead revenant creature, a witch, something metaphysical, something
pagan, death. Yeah.
And then ultimately that word morphed through Turkish into Slavic languages. And then when the Austro-Hungarian Empire pretty much took over the Slavic areas, when the first officials were going there, they were noticing like these people are digging up the undead, and then they have these things called a upir, and then through Austrian into French, it became vampire, and then vampire. So it's been around. That's the development of the word. So it's been around. Now, one of the really crazy folklore myths around vampires is the origin of vampires. And this is pretty crazy. So who was Adam's wife?
Eve.
Right?
Yeah. I'm going to go with Eve.
Last time I checked.
Thanks.
I'm almost like 100% confident on that.
You're pretty good?
No heresy button there.
No heresy button.
Okay, now.
Yet.
I didn't know. Yes.
Yet. There is tradition in medieval Jewish tradition and throughout other kind of more Gnostic beliefs that Adam actually had a first wife before Adam, Lilith.
Before Eve.
Before Eve, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah.
And her name was Lilith. And essentially Lilith she's held up now as kind of like an icon of feminism. And the whole thing was that she didn't want to submit to her position as a woman. She wanted to have power over the man and conversely, whatever, right? So Lilith then refused to accept her position and left the Garden of Eden. And because of that, she had nothing to eat. So she started eating the blood of animals.
Wow.
And she just forewent the whole apple thing.
Yeah,
that's very biblical though. Right. So how far back does that legend come out? Like when do you have like the first?
At least in the 9th century.
Wow.
And people talking about Lilith goes back before that. But as far as I could tell and what I researched, that was the first time the connection between Lilith and being the mother of all vampires.
That's fascinating.
So then they said, well, then the mythology around Lilith started to expand in that she was jealous that Eve was having children, and she didn't have children because she didn't have a spouse. So eventually she became so crazed with wanting to have children that she eventually started having relations with demons. And her children with these demons were the first vampires.
Makes
crazy.
a lot of sense. Yeah.
Some logic to
Now,
that.
now this is all
to that.
Now, this is all just total myth,
Nonsense,
folklore,
yeah.
nonsense. But it's still a pretty interesting concept that's how far back people would want to trace vampires, right to the Garden of Eden, that this woman who was expelled from the Garden of Eden hooked up with demons, and that's
What's
how
the whole
vampires.
benefit like to humanity with demons? Like, where does that fixation occur? Like,
Well,
you know,
demons
like
are real.
Huh?
Demons are real.
Right.
Or
demons
like
are,
how we're
demons are
culturally
real.
fixed on like these type
This
of
particular manifestation.
Well, and that's what I was
of
thinking. Like, how many movies have I personally watched about vampire slayers or vampires or
video games you play?
Video games for sure.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, Castlevania growing up, and there's something that definitely is intriguing, and I definitely want to kind of watch the movie or participate in the video game. So, I think it appeals to something deep within us that
Good and evil.
we're aware of the spiritual reality of like the invisible reality of evil and the presence of demons. And we want to visualize it, and we need to have a visual connotation of it so that we could battle it back, perhaps, or muster up a certain amount of energy and zeal to battle back the impulses of evil.
So you've got the good and the evil. That's something that's inherent, I think, to every human is understanding that, hopefully, or trying to grasp it mystically or through tangible things. But the manifestation of that in a vampire.
Well, see,
right,
a lot
it becomes a little bit more tangible in a sense of where that manifestation occurs.
A lot of the mythology and a lot of the belief in vampires comes from the misunderstanding or the lack of understanding people had with the physical processes of death, right? For people in the Middle Ages and before, in the Bronze Age or whenever, dying was a very unexplored thing. They just knew people died, and then the decomposition of a body was not something that you saw because you buried people.
Okay.
So, but then people would disinter them for whatever reason, and they would see that when a person dies, a lot of times back then, especially in non-climate controlled areas, their body would puff up, they would get white, and some of the processes would force blood up from the stomach and it would drip out the mouth.
And they would grow fangs.
Well, no, but so your fingernails would continue to grow as well.
Oh,
So after
wow.
you die, so they'd find them, they're puffy, so they're not decomposed. They have long nails and they've got blood dripping from them. It's
Ew.
like, well, this dude's been
That's
out.
creepy.
This dude's been out eating people, right? Because why else would there be blood, right?
And he's gained weight.
Right.
And I mean, there's a lot of
Right, so it
There's
cut-
a lot of fat vampires. I don't know.
Yeah, so it came from like this misunderstanding of what happens when people die.
Wow.
So, and you'll see that with a lot of mythologies that it's trying to attempt to explain physical processes in the world that people didn't understand.
Did you see Tony Malucci the other day? You know, he died about 2 months ago. I think he's turned into a chubby vampire.
Somebody cut his nails.
Oh my God. Somebody give that guy a manicure, would you?
No, yeah, care for the dead is one of the virtues,
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
works of mercy.
Absolutely. Works of mercy.
Yeah.
So yeah, go around cutting their nails and
you
everything.
click- That's right.
There's
Wipe off that blood.
there's a job for somebody in the Dark Ages, you know,
Right.
The manicurist of
the vampire.
Bring out your
bodies.
dead.
Bring
Yeah,
out
and
your
then
dead.
Chop up the nails.
Yeah, there's a lot of other manifestations of death and in the Dark Ages.
Absolutely.
And
Because
things.
they-
Now
they-
it's starting to make sense to me a little bit.
They were knee deep in death, man.
Yeah, they
Literally,
were
I mean,
just-
it was there. You know.
And you know, there's also during those ages as well, just the fascination of death as it relates to art and those expressions, which I'm sure that you're going to get into in a little bit, but to also consider, you know, our own modern day. You know, how many towns are being developed? You know, I'm living in a new town in Nocatee in Florida. It's a pretty quick development, and you know, it's coming up. But like, how many of those towns are zoning like these massive cemeteries? You know, or you know, with an appreciation of the memento mori of our faith, like to remember our death. You know, how often do we go into our church and there's a cemetery on the church grounds or the properties? Most of these new churches are not being zoned, you know, in their site planning for cemeteries or even for columbariums or interment places for ashes. And I think it's an overall kind of response to the reality of death that we don't even want to look at it, that we don't even want to consider it. And I think that's extremely problematic because every single liturgy that we celebrate, in the liturgy of the Eucharist, we continue to commemorate the dead, those who have gone before us, marked with the sign of faith, to remember those of our family members. When we think of like where we could be closest to our family members that have gone through death into this reality that is unknown, that is not seen, we can not get any closer to our loved ones that have passed on than in the liturgy of the Eucharist when we are commemorating the dead, because it's right there where Jesus' paschal mystery, his victory over death, is accomplished once again, and that sacrifice is made present. But in our culture, we are truly, I don't know, man, I'd love to get your take on it, but clearly, like, as I'm driving around, I'm not seeing a ton of cemeteries being established in public squares where people will remember that.
I just saw, I think it was either Oregon or Washington, where the government approved that people can now be composted. Like literally, they're taking.
That's just gross.
I mean, it's just.
Now, for our listeners who don't know what that is, what is that?
Well,
Basically turned into mulch.
yeah, turned into mulch.
Yeah. Or there's other treatments where you're put into a tree or into jewelry.
Yeah, it shows such a shift on how we view death now.
Yeah.
It's like,
It's
it's
kinda
again, it's
bizarre.
vanity. It's like, well, I'm being mulched or I'm being turned into a diamond or whatever. But anyway, back to Dracula.
Yeah. Because this is that response. So I mean, like,
Right.
it's the treatment of death.
It's the understanding of death, and through the lens of faith, you have now this hope, this resurrection, this unity with the body of Christ, and this, you know,
and like the vampire take on it is a complete twist.
it's a complete twist without that hope.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people would say that the mythology that arose around the vampire in the Middle Ages, when it started to really go from less of a just a voidless creature, right? That was a revenant undead, to where you start getting what we would recognize as a vampire traits. A lot of them are essentially just the reverse of the Eucharist, the reverse of Jesus in the Eucharist, right? It's a blood that, so if a vampire, instead of you consuming Christ's blood and getting everlasting life, a vampire consumes your blood and gives you everlasting death, right? A lot of these things were looked at as essentially, literally a lowercase antichrist, because they were direct parallels to the Eucharist.
And then you got you know, like this is why you have holy water, and this is why you have the Catholic Church is brought, like the sacramentals of the church are brought in to fight these vampires. There's always that response of Christ.
And then the distinction between what Christ does in his offering. So he offers his body and blood for our salvation, where the action of evil or the demonic presence in our life, and clearly illustrated in the vampire's action, is more of take and bite and draw from and steal life to face type of an action, you know, and it can be illustrated so clearly in these different cultural expressions in art and even in modernity, these movies. You know, and that is absolutely what evil does in our midst.
So who's the most famous vampire of all time?
Dracula.
Absolutely.
Count. One stinky dinky.
I love that guy.
Sesame Street, dude.
I love that guy.
That's my favorite. I think he's the most popular.
All right, so before we get into Dracula, since you brought up the count,
thank you.
Since you brought up the count, I'm going to bring up a pretty interesting point about vampires. Vampires, one of the things in the folklore that says that, you know, you throw salt at a vampire. Do you know why they believe this?
Well, isn't it something like the vampire? It has to like count every grain of salt. It's like this kind of arithmophobia, or like type of, you know, like
compulsive
it's
behavior.
Yeah.
So you would throw salt at a vampire or rice or sand, and they would have to stop. So if it was chasing at you, you throw salt over your shoulder. And then have to sit there and count every one of them.
Oh man, this is open.
Be careful with that salt.
Use it liberally, people.
Yes.
So with Sesame Street, with the count being addicted to counting, that literally has a historical precedent in folklore.
That's so cool. That's
so anyway,
cool.
So Sesame Street started this whole thing on counting salt.
Yes. All right. So Dracula. Dracula was a real person. Dracula was based off of a real person called Vlad Tepes. Now, Vlad Tepes was a Romanian prince, right? And this is when the Ottoman Empire was starting to invade through the Slavic lands, right? And Vlad Tepes was a prince who was leading the fight against them. And he was really effective at it, right? He became known as Vlad the Impaler because one time the Ottomans were coming in and they sent an advanced scout to go and start the battle. And then the bulk of the forces were coming up. Vlad Tepes and his forces killed them all, took all of them, all these soldiers, and put them on 8-foot tall stakes.
Lord have mercy.
So then when the rest of the Ottomans came, they see 5,000 dead bodies hanging on stakes, impaled. Bless. And they're like, I'm out. Yeah. I do not want Romania this bad. I'm out.
Talk about inciting fear in your enemy. You don't want to go up against Vlad the Impaler. Like that is just like, you know, talk about WWF names. Like that's got to be the most frightening. The Undertaker has nothing on
the Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah. Vlad the Negotiator wouldn't have worked so well.
No, definitely not.
Right. So anyway, the reason that Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler became known as, now, in Western society, he's looked at as kind of this creepy, but he's a national hero in Romania. He's like the guy who saved their country. So he's a hero there. But he was in what was called the Order of the Dracul, or the Dragon. And this was a religious order, kind of like the Knights Templar or whatever, who their vow was to fight the invading Ottoman Empire. So Vlad Dracul, so Dracula. So his father was the first one of his lineage to be as a member of the Order of the Dragon. So since he was the diminutive, he was Dracula. So Dracula, that's where the word Dracula comes from, is a Christian religious order to fight the Ottoman invasions.
Some of the more recent movies kind of pull on a little bit of that and kind of share it.
So the Dracula and vampire lore really gets its start in the way that we recognize it now in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Bram Stoker wrote his book, I think it was in the 1890s, and that's where most of the things that we consider, you know, he's a suave, debonair vampire who's afraid of light and salt and crucifixes, who comes from Romania. That's where almost all of that comes from. Because before that, it was more of the Nosferatu type vampire where they're ugly, shriveled, demon bat-looking guy, right?
Puffy faces, and long fingernails.
Right, it is.
Yeah.
And then after that,
They
they
clean
become
them up a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, Bram, so good to
Yeah,
vampires.
Bram takes all the wild exotic stuff out of Eastern Europe and puts it in a nice British suit, right? So in that book, that's where you start getting the concepts that vampires are afraid of holy water and crucifixes, because the main character, the vampire hunter in it, is Abraham Van Helsing. Mm-hmm. Now, Abraham Van Helsing in this book is a Catholic, right? And Bram Stoker was not Catholic. And his views on what Catholicism was a little bit strange in the way that he personified it in Van Helsing. So like for example, Van Helsing would take little pieces of the Eucharist and put it around the doorway so a vampire could come in. And they're like, isn't that wrong? And in the book, Van Helsing's like, I have a dispensation. Dude, that's not how dispensations work, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of the whole concept of what we think of as vampires comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
More the modern approach.
Right.
Yeah.
And how that's drawn from the Old Testament with the blood of the lamb, over the doorposts, and but
that would be a great sacrilege.
That would be if you did that with the Eucharist. That is absolutely,
you're worse than a vampire.
Well, that's excommunicable. Yeah. So those are grounds for excommunication because of
desecration.
The desecration of the Blessed Sacrament, the treasure of our church. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
So in the book and in the movies, Van Helsing is always kind of a very learned, very Catholic vampire hunter. But in reality, there was in the real world actual vampire hunters. And it's pretty crazy, some of the mythology around them. Now,
so it went from like movie to like some Comic-Con type guy saying, I'm going to go out and hunt vampires.
No, because I saw that vampire, the Van Helsing Vampire Slayer movie.
Okay.
The one with
what was his
Wolverine
name?
Dude?
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other one, have you ever seen Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer? That came out. I never saw
bizarre.
that. It seemed bizarre.
Yeah.
So we've got this
from the movies,
this sort of chronology of this movie, and now people watching the movie and being like,
well, no, vampire slayers are actually a thing way before the book and way before the movies. So I mean, back in the Middle Ages, there were vampire hunters, professional vampire hunters, and
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. So they were known as hawthorns in the language that they were at. So, and that was named after the type of wood that you would drive through a vampire's heart. But they were always believed to have been born on a Saturday. So they were called Sabbatarians.
Oh, wow. So there's only one strand of wood that you could actually use for a stake to drive through?
I don't know. That's just where the name derives from.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And then when munitions came out, whenever that was, then it was a silver bullet.
Dude, I'm still on the movie thing, but do you remember Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Stuck on the movies.
Dude, that was it all comes from the movies, right?
Yeah.
No, but that was when I was growing up.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out where that lines are. So there are vampire slayers previously, and
most movies, like even like Dracula Untold, that more recent, I think it was like 2013, 2014 when that movie came out. And it's basically tracing these historical moments and where this is all coming from. So there is historical connotation and it's really coming from somewhere, but it never really covers like the accurate history of it.
So it never includes Buffy.
Did it
there is history?
Buffy? Yeah, there was a Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and she was really beautiful.
Do you remember John Carpenter's Vampires? Where it's just all priests hunting vampires.
Oh,
it was, what's his head? James Woods.
Yes.
That was a great movie.
I actually loved it. I love that movie.
Yeah. So anyway, so there was real vampire hunters, and they were called Sabbatarians because it was believed that anyone born on Saturday or the Jewish Sabbath was able to see undead creatures when no one else could.
Interesting.
And they were believed to be the child of a vampire and a human woman. So you'll see that. Pretty weird, right?
So weird.
So you'll see that even like in Castlevania, the video game, Simon Belmont's, I think, half vampire or something like that. His father is Dracula, right? So that it was kind of a thing that children of vampires spent their life trying to kill vampires. And the things they would always carry with them, I think we know, right? Silver crucifix, holy water,
I could barely pick this thing
And
up.
you know, if you're listening,
Salt.
if you're listening now and you want a vampire kit, you go to patreon.com.
No, we're not offering vampire kits, but they do.
I think we should, man.
Okay, we will do.
we need
Okay,
some-
no. Here's what we can do. I will put a vampire kit on there.
Yes.
we can get them. We'll put 3 of them on there, and we'll put it at some crazy, number. And if you want it, you can get a vampire kit. But
That
they
would be
sell
cool.
vampire kits, and even vintage ones from like the 1600s in Europe. You can find them on eBay.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to like Romania or anything like that, that's one of the things that they're like, oh, buy a real vampire
Those
kit.
are the authentic ones.
They're
Authentic.
We started this thing.
Come here,
eBay,
I
or
give
do you
you a
want
good
one?
price.
Do you want one from Romania? eBay, Romania. eBay,
Well, you
Romania.
can buy one from eBay from Romania. They have this thing called shipping.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could
It's
see like
great.
the negotiation going like
I think I saw that in a movie.
30 pesos or whatever, right?
Pesos?
and you're like,
They use euros, dude.
I know. Okay, euros, 30 euros. You're like, I was just like giving you a hypothetical situation.
Yeah, that when Bulgaria has and Romania have adopted the peso.
They're like,
You know nothing of economics, sir.
that's why we have a Patreon because we know nothing about economics.
Yeah.
No, so the 30 euros, yeah. And then you're like, no, I'll give you 10. He's like, this is the good one.
This is the real good
This
stuff.
is the good one.
killed
This is
two
not
vamp-
crap from China.
You killed 2 vampires at once. I get one for your kid too.
Oh, that's funny.
So traditionally, the things that they would keep, or like in a vampire kit, were skeleton keys, so that you can go and unlock any of the doors where vampires were hiding. A wreath of garlic, right?
yes.
Because
Why not?
vampires hate garlic.
Yeah.
I love garlic.
That's
love
why I
garlic.
eat garlic every day.
Maybe that's why
I just take raw cloves of garlic and just throw them in my mouth. And I'm
you?
Oh, yeah, I do.
That's bizarre.
Almost like a dip. While you're dipping, I'll just throw like a garlic clove in my mouth. Mainly to ward off the vampires.
and your parishioners.
That's the penance that's, absolutely embedded in the sacrament itself. They have to just smell my garlic strewn breath.
Padre, you stanky. They put it up cellophane over the screen of the confessional, so I gotta smell it. So silver crucifixes, holy water. They would have a branch of wild roses that if you put that on top of a coffin of a vampire, they couldn't open their coffin or whatever.
It's the first time I've ever heard
What
that
about
one.
a dagger? Is there?
Well, yeah, and
That's
then they would
coming.
bring wooden stakes and a hammer. And then also
So you
pistols.
take the wooden stake and you hit it with the
Like,
hammer.
hold still. I'm trying to hammer this into your back. Please hold still. I'm not done yet.
So now what a lot of people don't know is that the Catholic Church actually created in the Middle Ages a document about hunting vampires and witches and other undead
Shut the
creatures.
This
front
is
door.
so good. Are you kidding me, Shield? Of
Absolutely.
course you found something like this.
So it was called the Malleus Maleficarum, which is Latin for the hammer of the witches.
Wow.
Yeah.
That almost immediately meets Vlad the Impaler. Like,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
eye to eye. This is great.
So it was written by 2 Dominicans, Johann Springer and Heinrich Kramer.
Okay.
And
I'm
it
still
was-
impressed.
They sound
Right.
good.
So it was
They sound
essentially
good.
supposed to be a compendium or a summa of all known techniques for fighting off evil creatures, witches, vampires, demons.
So it's kind of
undeads.
like a catch-all.
Right. And they had-
Vampires included, just lumped into there. Why not?
yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, look, if you're going to hunt zombies or demons or vampires, you got to be prepared.
You
You
gotta
never
know how to do it.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's like when you lift up a log, man. Like all different kinds of things are to come out, right?
Yeah.
So if you scare up a vampire, good chance that you're going to have a mummy,
Absolutely.
something. I don't
And,
know.
and you have to have rules and you have to
Aliens.
have guidelines, and to think of Zombieland. There were actual things, like the double tap rule.
Yep.
So these are the rules that the church provided. So this is
Absolutely.
good stuff.
Yeah, they
Thanks be to
talk
God.
specifically about vampires, and they talk about how the Greeks, like Euripides, would talk about vampires, and it's like really like scholarly and stuff. It's pretty interesting. It's
Wow.
available out there if anyone wants to go read it.
We
Should throw
post
it on
that.
our social media pages.
Now, this is not an officially approved church document. This is not something that's
Okay. Now,
Now
we're
you're
getting
back.
somewhere.
Yeah. Now you're backsliding.
but this was just written by Dominicans. It's not like the Vatican's like, yeah, cool, but let's put this on the shelf right next to our other, to the catechism. It's not like that, right? This is the Middle
let's put
Ages,
it
man.
next
It's
to our
wild.
document.
So
on
what were
cats.
some of the comments in there that stood out for you? looking at it.
Really, I thought what they were talking about that was really cool, like I said, was how they were tracking, how they were relating specific demons to different mythological appearances. So they would say, like, well, the Greeks were mentioning this, but we conjecture that it was actually this demon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they were taking mythology and
grounding it in reality if they could find.
And that's actually something interesting that Father Amorth, Gabriel Amorth, did in his book, An Exorcist Tells a Story, because he started identifying people that have had like these apparitions, say of like a family member or other types of apparitions, and associating them primarily with demons. Mm-hmm. And, because seeing the dead or interacting with the dead can be a ploy of evil to draw you away from the person of Christ and his salvific grace for the dead. So it's pretty interesting.
So Pope Benedict XIV, he wrote, there was a thing that they were trying to codify the canonization process. So he wrote a document called De Sevorum de Beatificatione et Sanctorum Canonizatione.
Wow.
Beatificazione.
Yeah,
You nailed that one.
Right. It's a bunch of Latin Italian. You read it. No, you read it. I want to see you do it.
De Sevorum de Beatificatione.
Somehow you turn into like a hip hop. You're like just grabbing a hold of the microphone for only the people that are watching on YouTube.
You see the
You just
inflection.
grab it. Let me give it a shot. I'm gonna give it a shot.
Here you go. You try.
All right, what are we reading here? De Servorum de Beatificazione et Sanctorum Canonizione.
Yeah, okay, so you guys can both shut your mouths.
Well, you got like the font on there is
Yeah,
like
because
tiny.
Because you're Slavic.
No,
and you're holding it at an angle.
Because I cut the path forward, man. It was already halfway tread down by the time you went down that road. Anyway, it's on the beatification of this holy servant. All right.
Okay, we're with you.
We should have just went with that, right?
We're with you. Okay.
So in that document, Benedict XIV, he was talking about how saints were incorrupt because that's one of the signs of sainthood. And he said that was an effect of divine intervention, that incorruptibility. And that he specifically said that all phenomena attributed to vampires were purely natural. So he was taking a very scientific approach to it. He's like, look, no, he's puffy and bloated because he's dead, right? And he said these are the fruits of imagination, terror, and fear, and vampires do not exist.
Ooh.
So Benedict,
There you have it, folks.
That's Benedict XIV. Now,
in case you were wondering.
Now, not too long after that, actually, just like a couple years later, there was a Benedictine, Dom Augustin Calmet. He was a French theologian and a scholar, and he would like converse with like Voltaire, right? So I mean, he was very prominent, and he wrote a book called "The Treatise on the Apparition of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants." So he wrote this whole book on.
And Voltaire was brilliant.
Yeah, and Voltaire. Because of that, he believed that vampires existed because of this book.
Because of this book.
Right.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, and Voltaire wrote, these vampires were corpses who were sent out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either at their throats or stomachs, which you don't really think of vampires biting
The jugular.
Right.
Yeah.
After which they returned to their cemeteries. The person so sucked waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, got rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite. It was in Poland, Hungary, Silesia, Moravia, Austria, Lorraine, and the dead made this good cheer.
Voltaire wrote that?
Yep, Voltaire.
Have you ever heard that a vampire would bite into the jelly roll of another human being? I mean, like that's something.
I don't know about you, but I got a six pack, bro.
That's kind of like the. It's kind of like the redneck vampires. They're like. That's like the natural light of vampires. Like
We're gonna eat the grizzle.
The refined ones are like, I'm going for the fresh blood from the jugular, where the finest blood comes right from the head. The other guys, look, man, I've been working all day long. I've been out here fighting all these priests and everything. I just want to sit down with a good
old
12 pack. Good old 12 pack of belly blood, right?
Belly blood.
I don't know why George W. Bush is a vampire, but anyway.
The beginnings of another movie that has not yet been produced. But think about it though, like the appetitive, right? So like the aspect of the stomach and how that could be drawn into what is base and bile, and then even like a god in and of itself. in relationship to the appetite and the gluttony of human beings. And then, like the throat and like the tongue as what defiles the human person, and, like the jugular. That's always what I've thought about when it comes to like a vampire drawing blood from somebody. It's like always from behind, and it's like,
oh yeah. Yeah.
The sneak up. That's why the salt over the shoulders. Yeah, the sneak move.
Sneak up jugular.
The sneak up jugular move. But that's why you flip the salt over your shoulder. I've done that since I was a child, though, by the way. Like whenever the salt would hit the table, you just throw it over it was supposed to be your right shoulder.
Yeah.
But now you know
where that
why.
comes from.
That's
Yeah.
where it comes from.
So they, right around this time, this is, the Enlightenment, and they're really starting to look for proof of things, right? So Calmette did this study, and he reviewed all the cases. See, most of these cases were coming from Eastern Europe, which is just now really, after the Great Schism and the way that history kind of evolved, the East was always very separate from the West. But then after the Ottomans and the Byzantine Empire fell, well, a lot of these former Eastern areas were much more closer because they had to be in relation to the Western Church, like Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, right? So, and then the Austrians basically took them over. So they started doing scientific research. Even the Empress, Maria Theresa, sent her personal physician to all of these cities and looked for real proof of vampires, and ultimately concluded that they weren't real, and forbade anybody from being a vampire hunter and outlawed the whole practice. But then the folk people still were into it. And what's really cool is that archaeologists have been finding what they call vampire burials. So real vampire burials where people would believe that a certain person was a vampire, and they're excavating and they dig up a grave and they'll find a body with a big rock in its mouth and staked to the ground.
Wow. It seems like the witch trials almost has that same type of reality. Yeah, in history. That's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, vampires, they're not real. Maybe they're. I don't know. I don't think so.
We'll leave it up to you.
They're not real. But it shows kind of the way that folklore and history adapts itself to the fears that people have about whatever is going on in the world. And vampires, it's specifically about death and decomposition and the natural forces of what happened. And I think people who get too invested in this, again, it's kind of like that sin of Saul, where you're really trying to look behind the veil to what death is. And, as a Christian, you should just learn to be okay with your death because it's coming.
Mm-hmm. But it's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Pretty
like
cool. Vampire movies are awesome.
It's kind of like a good and evil, I mean, almost like a comic book.
Makes great stories.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to what we were sharing at the beginning of the show is, to make visible what is invisible, because the fascination of the spiritual battle that we are
so
waging.
Much salt on you.
Oh man, look at that, dude.
Hold on,
Don't brush.
1,
2,
2, 3, 4, 5. This could take a while. 6, 7.
You see? And that's how you ward them off. You just drop the salt and let them count. So, but it goes back to like making visible what is invisible. And in this spiritual battle that we are currently in, it helps, I think. It helps me. I mean, when I need to just sit down and just kind of clear my mind and watch a movie, I absolutely watch like a Vampire Slayer, Vampire Hunter, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Slayer.
Yeah, you obviously have seen them all.
The one with what's his head? The dude from The Matrix, Keanu Reeves.
Yeah.
That one's pretty good. John Carpenter's Vampires is pretty good.
I even enjoyed The Priest. You remember that one where he was going out and he was slaying vampires? And that was a while back. That was like 2000 and probably like 8 or 9 or something.
I don't remember that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also, Castlevania, dude, that was the
Hands
game.
down.
Dude, that was an amazing video game.
Even their remake in Nintendo 64 was awesome.
Yeah.
All of those. I think they have one recently too that came out.
Oh, they continue to make them. Yeah,
they continue to make it.
Actually, I have one of the retro Nintendo things, the original one, and it's got Castlevania 1 and 2 on there. Sit down with a beer and play some Castlevania, man. That sounds awesome.
This show, talk about awesome. This show was awesome. This was a really, really cool episode.
Okay, but you know what? Don't go slinking away back into your dark corners yet, Padre.
Just gonna go lay down in my casket.
Yeah, no, we have an inquisition for you.
Oh Lord,
and it's not gonna
sounds bloody.
Just from the sides of the mouth. So, This is a hypothetical question, presuming that vampires are real, which they're not. Okay. Vampires, one of their characteristics is that they're undead. They are dead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But they still have the ability, like we see in the movies, to have a conversion because they still are rational souls. Now, say me and Ryan are out. Well, let's say the three of us are out and we had some beers and then we find ourselves into a situation where we have to kill a vampire, right? Our producer and cameraman, Howard, he got bit. And we got to put you down, bro. Sorry. So we have to put Howard down, but Howard wants to make a reversion back to the faith. Mm-hmm. So Ryan's already got the stake through him, right? And he's dying. He's got like seconds left, right? Can you give a vampire last rites since he's already dead?
I'm going to grab the microphone like Ryan Delacroix right now.
You go ahead and do that.
And answer this now.
Last rites are for the healing of the sick.
But
the vampire's already dead.
The vampire's dead, so there is no conversion for those who are already dead.
But he's undead.
But he is dead.
But he still has a rational soul and the rational ability to make decisions.
But his state in life, is he dead or is he not dead?
He's
a vampire. If a vampire, so
what are we dealing with here?
I'm trying to figure this out.
Can you give last rites to a vampire because he's already dead?
No.
So then you just say, "Sorry, dude, you're done." There's no chance for him to.
Bye, Howie.
Sorry, Howie.
You're a vampire.
You're going to HE double hockey sticks, bro.
I'll get to you before that, Howard, and administer the sacrament of the sick. But let me just say, like, so the state in which the vampire Howard
Howie Wowie
is dead. So he's one dead, but now his whole life is ordered to drawing life from and the actions of the demoniac.
But he's doing a second deathbed conversion.
He's not doing the conversion. That's impossible.
And nobody's talking about my soul because I'm driving a stake through his heart.
And you're saying, hold still with the hammer.
Well, I think we've already established in other episodes that it's okay to kill zombies and demons.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we did. Yeah, there's precedence there.
So you're saying that...
I say there's no conversion after death.
I think that... But what about undeath? Because you still have a rational soul. So
if vampires...
So has a vampire already had their particular judgment?
If vampires do not exist...
Right.
But hypothetically that they do,
right? They're
still considered dead,
right?
Therefore,
but they still are making decisions.
They aren't making decisions. They are. So this goes right to John Paul II's contribution in philosophy as it relates to freedom, right? So freedom's not to do whatever it is that we want, but freedom is always in the choice to do the good,
right?
So the compulsion of the vampire is compulsively enslaved to the actions that are not good.
Yeah, but he knows he's dying and he's like, I'm sorry.
He already died.
But he's dying a second time. There's no repentance. Dude, that's cold, man.
We're talking hypothetical circles.
No, you're always the weepy, merciful one. I'm like, dude, come on,
merciful.
This vampire's
it's my state in life as a priest.
All right, fine.
He did.
And I celebrate the sacraments, which is an expression of God's mercy.
And I stab vampires and I deny them sacraments.
You
get nothing. Right. You die and you go to hell, vampire. All right.
He's cold.
All right. What do you? I don't know. Let's
closing the casket on that. No.
Okay. That's cold, man. It's cold, but you know what?
Dunskies.
In the vampire hunting business, it's a cold business.
It is a cold business.
There's no mercy.
No mercy.
No.
Yeah, it's bloody too.
It's
bloody.
Very.
Yeah. It smells like garlic too.
So we want to thank you so much for joining us on the Catholic Talk Show. You could connect with us in many different ways. You could go to our website, CatholicTalkShow.com. You could visit us on all the social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And certainly we thank our Patreons, and especially the Patreons that will soon be getting a vampire hunting kit in the mail for supporting us in a big way. I still think that's a great idea.
I'm going to have to go find somebody. Yeah, I'll make it happen. All right, cool, guys. Let's go.
Stay safe.
I think you just got salt in your eye.
Did I really? Ah, it burns.
All right, let's go kill some vampires, boys.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.